Hey friends, it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card with the brand new Bear Family stamp set from Hello Bluebird. And I'm going to be coloring with my Copic markers to match the Echo Park Our Baby 6x6 pad. So I'm just going to flip to the sheet that I want to use as my color inspiration, and I'm going to tuck that under my cardstock panel so I can base my combos off of that. I've stamped those images out on Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock with Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink, and I'm going to jump straight in with my bears. And I'm trying to match the brown that is in that pattern paper, so I decided to go with the E30 markers. I'm going to use E31, E33, and E35 for the two adult bears. Starting with that E35, I'm just going to do one at a time. Laying in those shadows there down the left-hand side of the body, since this one is facing more toward the right. And then I'll start to blend that out with the E33, just pulling that color in toward the center of the face and toward the belly. Next, I'll come in with the E31, soften the edge of that E33. And at this point, I realized that I was going to need a fourth shade because I wanted to keep the face and the belly even lighter. So I decided to pull in the E30 for that. So I'll just fill in any remaining white space, and I am going to come back and do a second layer in a little bit, but I wanted to kind of move on and see how everybody was looking before I decided to do that, because I wanted there to be a slight difference between the baby bears and the adult bears. So for the baby bears, I'm actually going to skip the E35, and I'm just starting with the E33 for the darkest. For this little one that is hugging his mom or dad, I'm imagining that it's the dad on this one, and then the other bear, the other grown bear, is the mom, since the little one is going to bring her a flower, but you can make him however you want. But I'm going to color them both the same, just flipping those shadows. For this little one, I'm going to put the shadows on the left side since he's facing right. And that keeps the face nice and light so you can really make out those features. I'm going to blend down in the reverse, and then for the babies, I'm actually going to leave a tiny amount of white space on their muzzles and even a little sliver on their bellies. And then I'll move on to the mama bear, and this time I'm switching back to my E35 for the darkest. And I did forget to color in the dad bear's other arm that was wrapped around the baby, so I'm going to go back and do that now while I'm doing the mama bear. So again, just doing those shadows the opposite side to keep her face nice and light. So her shadows are going down the right hand side with that E35, and then blending out with the E33. I'll bring in the E31 and make sure I catch the edge of the previous shade so that I get a nice smooth blend, or as smooth as possible. Then I'm going to keep the face and belly nice and light with that E30 marker. So I wanted to do a second layer like I mentioned. I'm actually going to do a second layer on both of the adult bears, and I'm going to do them at the same time because this is really quick and easy to do. I have already mapped out where I want all of my colors to go, so I just have to add that second layer right over top, and it really does add so much depth and saturation to the color levels as well as smoothing out that blend. So it's definitely something I recommend, especially with the darker shades. I think it really does make a huge difference in the way that your images look. So I'm just starting with the darkest and blending down in the reverse, coloring them in mostly with those darkest three shades, but saving a little bit of space on the face and the belly for that lightest, that E30. And I didn't even bother with a second layer on the babies because they were pretty well blended on their own. Lighter shades can often blend a little bit easier than the darker ones. So now I'm going to add in some rosy cheeks, but I want to use pink tones that are kind of in the peachy pink range to match the shade in the pattern paper. So I went with YR01 and YR02, and I'll also color in the insides of their ears. So the YR02 first, and then blending that out with the YR01. And then I'm going to start pulling in that mustardy yellow, and I'm going to use Y21 and Y26 for that. Just the two shades because everything I'm coloring with these is super duper tiny. So I'm going to do the bees, and I did add a second layer of just the Y26, and I colored over them completely because the other stripes are going to be darker, so it was just easier to color them completely rather than trying to color in each individual stripe with the yellow. And then I'm going to do all of my flowers to be Black-Eyed Susans, so I'm adding that Y26 closest to the center, and then blending out with the Y21 to the edges of the petals. I didn't want to bring in any black or gray into this color palette since it wasn't in the pattern paper. So I'm actually going to do what would normally be the black stripes on the bee in a dark brown instead. I'm using E44 and E47 for that. And I will also do the centers of the flowers so that they can look like Black-Eyed Susans. Just a touch of the E47 first, and then blending that out with the E44. And then for the greens, I wanted something that was more in that sage tone to match the pattern paper. The closest I had in my Copic colors was YG41 and YG45. And again, I'm only using the two shades because all of those leaves are super duper tiny. So just a little of that YG45 down at the base of the leaf, and then the YG41 is what's going to fill in the rest toward the tips of each leaf. And I even added a tiny bit of that YG41 into the bee's wings to give them a tiny bit of color. And then I'm going to get a black Sakura Jelly Roll pen going and go over the eyes of all of my bears that have their eyes open to make them nice and bright and shiny. And then I will trim all of these images out with their matching dies. For my background, I've taken a strip of Bristol Smooth Surface cardstock, and I'm actually going to create a yellow sky, like a little sunrise or sunset sky, because I didn't want to add any blue into the combo since there's no blue in the pattern paper. So again, I'm pulling out that mustard yellow like I use for the bees and the flowers. So I'm using Scattered Straw Distress Oxide ink and blending that in kind of an upside down U shape and leaving a little bit of a white glow down in the center bottom of this little panel. So once I'm happy with the blend on that, I'm going to grab an acrylic block and spritz some plain water onto that. And then I will pick that up with a paintbrush and tap that all over the background. Let that react with that Distress Oxide ink and kind of lift that color up a bit. And then once it's soaked in for a few seconds, I'll dab that up with a paper towel. It's going to leave some little white bleached out spots. And then I'm also going to add some of that scattered straw with some water and splatter that over the background as well to give it a little bit of movement and interest. And then I will set this panel aside to dry, clean up my mat, and then I'm going to take another little strip of Bristol, which I've trimmed down with the grassy knoll dye from Hello Bluebird, and I'm going to use some bundled sage Distress Oxide ink for the grass. And again, I'm placing that darkest shade up at the top of the piece and then blending down toward the bottom and leaving a little tiny bit of white space down there as well to match the sky. Just darkening up the edges where the grasses are and being really careful not to bend those little grasses. And then I'll repeat the same process, splattering some water on that strip of cardstock first, letting it soak in and react with those inks, and then blotting that up, and then splattering some of the bundled sage on there as well with a little bit of water mixed in to make it more fluid. So once I have that done, I will set this aside to dry as well, and I'm going to go and start working on my sentiment. I'm going to take a piece of ground coffee cardstock from Lawn Fawn and treat that with a Rabbit Hole Designs powder tool. And I am selectively stamping a sentiment from Bear Family. I'm going to use the whole sentiment, but I wanted to create some separation between the word sending and the rest of the phrase. So I am masking off only the word sending first and inking that up with Versamark ink and just removing that little mask, which is just a little piece of Post-it tape, once I am ready to stamp that down. Then I'm going to take that sentiment off. I've cleaned it and I'm going to shift it over just slightly, and this time I'm going to place the mask over the word sending so that I can stamp the rest of the phrase, and that's just going to allow me to be able to separate out the word sending from the rest of it and cut it down into two separate strips. So I'm stamping that down twice as well, just being really careful to use light pressure so I don't push the letters down too much and they don't kind of squish and kind of become indistinct. And then I will cover that in some white embossing powder. And I had a little bit get where I didn't want it, so I'm going to grab a dry paintbrush and just brush off any of that excess embossing powder where I don't want it. So part of that word sending actually ended up getting on there, so I'm just brushing that off and then kind of removing any of those little flakes of embossing powder that are around that sentiment where I don't want them. Once I'm happy with how that's looking, I will bring my heat gun to that. I'd like to heat it off to the side for about 30 seconds, 45 seconds maybe, and then I bring it equally to the front and the back so that it kind of minimizes some of the warping, and heat that up until that embossing powder is all nice and melted and bright white. So there you can see that. For the inside of the card, I'm going to pop my card base in there. This is a piece of craft cardstock from Lawn Fawn, and I'm going to ink up another image and sentiment using walnut ink. And I picked the one that says, "You're the berry best," which I think is super sweet and can go for so many different occasions. Then I'll take the leftover ground coffee cardstock and die cut the word sweet from the Sweet Friend Words dies from Hello Bluebird, and then I'll go back to my pattern paper pad to choose a complementary print to use with that plaid. So I'm just flipping through. There's lots of options in here that would have worked, but I decided to go with this tone-on-tone little X print. It almost looks like little cross stitches, so it kind of complements the plaid really nicely. So I'm going to start assembling the pieces that are going to make up my card. I'm going to take the grass and adhere that to the sky background, and then I can set that aside for a moment while I adhere that plaid print to a piece of plain white cardstock just to add a bit of stability to that pattern paper, make it a little bit more sturdy so that I can pop it up with some foam tape. And I'm actually going to cut that down with my paper trimmer into two different strips, and I'm going to line up the top strip with the top edge of the card so that I can get my background piece placed correctly. And I'll just line that up where I want it. I want the top edge of that sky to be just under that pattern paper, and it was just a little hair too long, so I'm going to trim that down with my Cutter Bee Teflon coated scissors. And then I can take that top plaid piece once again, and I've added the foam tape like I said, so I'll just peel off those release papers, line that up with the top two corners and make sure it's on there nice and straight, and then press it down. And then I'll take the bottom piece and peel off the release papers for that, and then line that up with the bottom two corners. So the actual scene will be recessed below that pattern paper, which I think is a fun look. I trimmed down the brown cross stitch print with the Hello Bluebird basic borders, one of the scallop dies, and I am going to add some liquid glue to that and line that up with the top edge of the bottom piece. And then I also cut down just a thin straight strip, and I will line that up with the bottom edge of the top piece just to help it frame in a little bit nicer. Then I can bring in my images and my sentiment. I'm actually going to start with my sentiment, and because it is such a delicate little die cut, I'm going to hold it with my EK Success reverse tweezers, and that way I can get the glue on there, and I'm just being very careful to only use the barest amount of liquid glue so it won't kind of squish out the edges once I lay it down. Then I can line that up in the center of the bottom part of that card and kind of keep my fingers out of the way until I'm ready to press that down. The rest of the sentiment I trimmed down into thin strips, like I said, and I'm going to take the larger one and place that right underneath the word sweet, and then the smaller one with just the word sending is going to go right above. So I just lined those up to make sure that that was how I wanted it to look, and then once I was happy, I committed to that by just adhering that down with some liquid glue. So the whole sentiment will say, sending sweet hugs and happy thoughts. Then I'm ready to start adhering my images, and I've added foam tape to the back of all of them. So I just want to get them placed how I want them before I start adhering them. Then I can just peel up the release papers and pop them back down into place real quick and easy. And I even did cut down some very small little pieces to make sure that every little bit of that was supported. I didn't want the little flowers or anything to be floppy so that they get bent when you go through the mail. The only exception was on these little bunches of flowers. I knew that one would overlap the bear's legs on each side, so I left off a little section for liquid glue there, and then just pop those up. And then I have two little bees, so I'm going to have one buzzing above the bunch of flowers over on the left, and then the other little bee I'm going to add buzzing above that baby bear in the center. So of course I had to add a little bit of stickles, so I'm going to take that and carefully add it to the butterfly's wings. This is Stardust Stickles, my favorite embellishment. I will also add it to the centers of the Black-Eyed Susans, so it's just a tiny little enhancement there. Very subtle, but I will lift that up so you can see all of the detail and give you another peek at the inside. I think this one turned out super adorable, so I hope that you guys enjoyed it too. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and leave me a comment down below, and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. All of the products that I used today will be listed and linked for you in the description bar below in case you'd like to pick up anything for yourself. And if you'd like to keep watching, here are 2 extra videos I thought you might also enjoy. You can click on either one to check them out. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today. I hope you had a good one, and I will see you soon in another video. Bye-bye.